think the most important thing that I can do, any other observer can do, is to say, I want this to be questioned. And one of the things about the hard sciences, for instance, is that you could replicate data, and then you could experiment, you can then falsify or verify. As you know, with these types of very complex social issues, that is very, very difficult. Having said that, if you were to go out and take the exact same steps that I have done, I challenge you. I will say, I bet you will reach the same conclusions. Now, it is very important to make the distinction between something as gruesome and as horrific as rape. And there is rape by one individual against another individual, but sometimes it's done in groups. That's even more horrific. And it's not nearly as horrific as somebody calling you bad names as you walk by, or touching you, or so. In terms of what is most gruesome, it is rape, especially by groups, and then very often that leads to homicide. So some of the victims actually die. And I didn't want this book to be just about that. When something like that happens in a European country, that is recorded. And in fact, the authorities make an attempt at finding the perpetrators and bringing them to justice. Now, you can debate if the severity of the punishment fits the crime. In some of these countries, these conversations are going on, but no one is debating that is horrific and that should be, and that's, you could only look at those statistics. If you did that, and then you ask those same authorities for the origins of the perpetrators, in many countries, you are going to run into, we just don't record that kind of data. And they have reasons for that. Germany, for instance, because of the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust and what they had done to all sorts of minorities, and other countries, like even the Netherlands, I don't think they would record the religious aspect of it. Some of them will, though, record. I've seen this in Norway, I've seen this in Denmark, I've seen it in Austria, even in Germany. At a given moment, there was a recording of the testimony of the victim or witnesses. Or some of the reporters would say, today in court, case XYZ was tried, and the perpetrator was from Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or Somalia or whatever. And as things evolved, journalists were told not to do that. And victims would sometimes testify, those who survive the ordeal, and if this goes to justice, they would describe the physical characteristics of the perpetrators. Now, that is the most gruesome aspect of it. Now go to the lightest. Let's just say the verbal abuse, the touching, the groping, stuff that in some countries is criminalized. Recently, in some countries, it's not yet criminalized, but stuff that is seen as inappropriate towards women, things that make women feel unsafe. And again, the victims of that kind of behavior will describe who the assailants are. And sometimes those recordings, at first, some of these countries would put down that information, these data points, and see them as important. But then in come the political correctness, the identity politics, immigration is sensitive, Islam is sensitive, we don't want to stigmatize. And then you will see these data points being dropped. You will see statistics that make it very clear that there is a correlation, at least, between a rise in sexual violence against women and immigration. And then someone else will be commissioned and will be told, okay, can you please give that a second look? And they would come and they would say, you know what, sexual violence against women is universal.
Yes, well, that's part of the complexity of the problem, because I was thinking as well, well, you also point out, for example, that many cases of sexual assault are never brought to the police, and no one knows how many cases are like that. And that's even more likely to be the case for the more minor forms, if we're allowed to make a hierarchy of sexual crimes, which I think is absolutely necessary. It's even more true for the more minor forms of sexual harassment, which I would say would certainly be of sufficient unpleasantness to potentially restrict women's, at least their sense of freedom in the public domain. But so a critic, and you cover this in the book as well, a critic might object, well, this is going to happen under any immigration scenario if the majority of the immigrants are male, because obviously males are implicated in this sort of crime, and if they're young, because young males are more likely to be criminal in all regards. And so maybe it has nothing to do with country of origin or ethnicity or religious background, but it's purely a demographic matter. And then there's another issue, which is even if it is true that immigration policy tilts so that young males are more likely to immigrate, that doesn't necessarily mean that should be stopped. There's a price to be paid for it, but there's potential benefits from it as well. And so lay out for everyone as exactly what you think the problem is and why because the other thing I thought too was, well, why did ION's critics are going to say, well, there's lots of contributors to violence against women that could conceivably be talked about. And you might say, well, you should attend to those that are the most dramatic, the most consequential, the most severe, but perhaps also to those that might be the most easily addressed. So, for example, I always think when I look at stats about violence against women that we should have a protracted conversation about alcohol, because alcohol contributes victims and perpetrators of violent crimes, about 50% of them are alcohol intoxicated. It's a massive contributor to violence of all types, domestic violence, every type of violence. And so if the kind of violence that you're describing is in fact related to immigration, which is a difficult thing to prove, how high up in the hierarchy of things to be concerned about that should that be, especially given the benefits of the humanitarian benefits even of a relatively more open immigration policy?
So here, I think, again, we're going to start talking about the trade-offs. And I think in terms of these trade-offs, what we're seeing is that the way I see it is that the rights of women